Los Angeles, California. With its beaches, Hollywood, and the fashion industry, has long been known as a mecca for eating disorders. Because it's got many women believing they're not pretty enough if they're not slim, sleek, and downright skinny. That health experts say has led to insecurity and low self-esteem, and as seen in postings all over the internet, has compelled many women across the U.S. to starve themselves to lose weight, a condition known as anorexia nervosa. Or to purge themselves of food they've just eaten by throwing up behind closed doors, known as bulimia nervosa. Or to engage in binge eating when they lose all control over how much food they eat.
We've only just begun.
America's wake-up call on how dangerous eating disorders are came 30 years ago with the shocking death of singer Karen Carpenter, who died from anorexia at the age of 32. She was so thin and weak, doctors say, that her heart simply stopped functioning. Since her death, eating disorder cases in America have reached epidemic numbers, according to recent health studies. An estimated 30 million Americans now suffer from some form of eating disorder, and worse, someone dies from an eating disorder in the U.S. every hour of every day on average, when their vital organs shut down after years of damage from extreme up and down weight loss or weight gain. It may surprise some to learn that eating disorders are in fact the #1 killer among all mental health illnesses.
I'm in the mood for food.
Though eating disorders have historically often been ignored by many food-loving Americans who blissfully take eating for granted.
What a joy to eat. Oh, feed me, feed me, feed me till
Kim Pike's sister, Casey, died at the age of 30 from bulimia. Kim, the big sister, Casey always looking up to Kim. At around the age of 15, Casey began to gain weight. The magazine she was reading at the time, says Kim, were telling her, you gotta be skinny. So Casey spent the next 15 years routinely throwing up her meals to keep the weight off. A painful ordeal, says Kim, that robbed the family of what should have been happier times together.
But I'll never get that time back.
As Casey struggled with her bulimia, few outside the house knew about it. Kim's family, on the surface, appeared like the typical all-American family. For example, at Kim's wedding, the family had its game face on. Kim's dad, Ron, and mom, Jeannie, and brother, Tom. Even Casey, despite her frail state, charmed guests during her wedding toast to Kim.
I wish you lots of love, laughter, and success.
It wasn't long after this special day at Casey's apartment when Casey was found sitting here lifeless on her balcony. She died after a 15-year battle with bulimia that had destroyed her vital organs.
Because all of those that could not be.
Today, almost 15 years later, Kim joins thousands of other Americans who've lost loved ones to eating disorders, who gather each year in front of the nation's capital, demanding that the government approve more funding for research of this deadly affliction. Presently, the $30 million spent each year on research amounts to only $1 a person when you consider there are 30 million people suffering from eating disorders. Twice that amount, $60 million, is being spent to paint and spruce up the U.S. Capitol dome.
My sister really didn't have the opportunity to live. She started her eating disorder so young and then died at 30. And she didn't get a chance to have a full life like a healthy person would. She didn't even have the chance for recovery.
Perhaps she could have had more research funding been available. According to one of the world's foremost experts on eating disorders, Dr. Walter Kay here at the University of California in San Diego. Dr. Kay says the alarming number of deaths each year from eating disorders, 8,000 of them on average, should be more than enough reason for the U.S. government to pour much more funding into education and treatment of eating disorders that are claiming so many lives.
They can be fatal. It may have the highest death rate of any psychiatric disorder, and you know, that really should get people's attention in terms of the seriousness of these disorders.
And when I looked at that X-ray,
Casey's former dentist, Barbara Pampalone, now retired, reflects back on Casey's dental charts, revealing her badly decaying teeth from stomach acid during years of throwing up her food. Clear evidence that Casey's eating disorder had taken a serious toll on her body.
Casey's health was breaking down.
Casey's dad, Ron, says he assumed Casey's eating disorder was something she could get over with willpower alone, like kicking a smoking habit.
I didn't realize that this problem was so complex.
So complex, the LA County coroner who performed the autopsy on Casey listed her cause of death as undetermined.
He had said to me, people don't really die of eating disorders, Kim.
Kim says she was told Casey's heart simply stopped functioning. CCTV found that often the actual cause of death in eating disorder cases is not always clear-cut. For example, as, say, dying from cancer. For example, a year before Casey died, the LA County coroner performed the autopsy on former Beatle George Harrison, who smoked like a chimney most of his life and suffered from lung cancer. And lung cancer is what is listed as the cause of death. Yet Casey's death, which Kim and family doctors believe was clearly caused by an eating disorder, was ruled undetermined. Kim asks, if Casey's death is not counted as an eating disorder death, how many others are not being counted as eating disorder deaths? An important question, because the number of eating disorder deaths each year are what the U.S. government bases its funding on each year for research. The more deaths attributed to eating disorders, the more funding the U.S. government will approve for research. Meanwhile, CCTV has discovered that the U.S. government may inadvertently be underfunding eating disorder research because eating disorder death statistics, as in Casey's case, may be going ignored or underreported. For example, when CCTV asked the LA County coroner for the number of recorded eating disorder deaths in the last decade here in Los Angeles County, a region of the country health experts say is arguably the eating disorder capital of the world, in its email response, the LA County coroner's office reports only 2 eating disorder deaths since 2008. Only 2. Kim Pike shared this statistic with former U.S. legislator Patrick Kennedy at this rally in Washington recently. Kennedy, considered a major force for more research and funding for eating disorders, found it difficult to believe that only 2 eating disorder deaths have happened in Los Angeles County since 2008.
2 people have died since 2008. Sent an email saying that. I was like, that's not true.
Kennedy believes the U.S. government may indeed be underfunding research and treatment for eating disorders because so many deaths are going underreported nationwide.
That is the big story.
That is the big story, agrees Claire Misko of the National Eating Disorders Association, or NEDA, the leading nonprofit organization in the U.S. advocating on behalf of and supporting individuals and families affected by eating disorders.
We know that 20 million women and 10 million men in the U.S. alone will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lives. This is, these are epidemic numbers, and yet we don't really have that reflected in funding, in legislation. We're making progress, but we have a long way to go.
While in the nation's capital recently, Kim shared Casey's story with Kitty Westin, who was perhaps the most galvanizing force among those advocating on behalf of eating disorder sufferers and their families.
So my daughter, Anna Westin, died from her eating disorder on February 17th, 2000.
An eating disorder led to the death of her young daughter, Anna Westin, in whose name legislation has been proposed, known as the Westin Act, calling for universal eating disorder prevention programs, better training for doctors in detection of eating disorders, and stronger health care coverage for treatment and therapy. It was the high costs of treatment and therapy that Anna had worried were becoming a huge financial strain on her family.
And one of the things she told her sister really shortly before she died was that I am a burden on this family. I'm destroying our family financially, and they would be better off if I were dead. And she died of suicide.
Kim Pike says in the case of her sister Casey, the LA County coroner's ruling that the cause of her death is undetermined is a slap in the face.
An extreme slap in the face. I certainly know why she died. She threw up herself to death over a long period of time. Why? Because we didn't have therapy that was strong enough then. We didn't have education. We didn't have advocacy. We didn't have insurance. We didn't have support systems. There was nothing in place. And that is why she died. If Casey's story doesn't count in the statistics and in the research and the funding, whose does? What are the real numbers? I don't think we have the right numbers. I don't think people really understand how many people really quietly suffer. And she was dying, truly. Her internal organs were shutting down. And her insurance company said, sorry, we're done with the treatment for her. No more, she's not sick enough to stay. And she had to leave.
In Casey's final days, the Oprah Winfrey Show had been her last resort. Casey had wanted to share her struggle with Oprah, drafting this email to a producer at the program, explaining how, at the age of 30, she'd been struggling with eating disorders now half of her life.
Struggling with bulimia and anorexia since I was 15, and after every failed program, I feel more humiliated and hopeless. I can't imagine what normal can feel like anymore.
I miss my sister every day. And I miss the family we could have had.
Casey had concluded her email to Oprah with hope for a better future.
We need more awareness, more support, and definitely more resources. Because otherwise, we are turning our heads on our own future.
Casey sent off the email on Sunday, March 10th, 2002. She died the next day.
And she's gone, and my family will never be the same.
In the 14 years since Casey's death, it's said that nearly 120,000 other Americans have died from eating disorders.